On a night of September 29 in 2020, the village of Hathras in Uttar Pradesh witnessed an atrocity so brutal it exposed the raw, festering wound at the heart of modern India, a wound rooted in caste, power, and impunity. That night, the police cremated the body of a 19-year-old Dalit woman without her family's consent, locked them inside their home, and moved swiftly before daylight could expose their act to scrutiny. The victim, a young woman from one of India's most marginalized communities, had died in a Delhi hospital 2 weeks earlier, a victim of torturous assault, spinal injuries, and, as her family and many rights activists maintain, of violence inseparable from her caste. Before her death, she had named her attackers, 4 men from a higher caste, the Thakur community, in statements recorded at the hospital and before magistrates. But the legal outcome was a bitter pill. In 2023, 3 of the 4 accused were acquitted. The one man convicted, Sandeep Thakur, was not found guilty of rape or murder. Instead, the court convicted him under culpable homicide not amounting to murder, a significantly lesser charge. The stark silence around the word rape in the verdict stung, especially in light of her multiple statements and her family's anguish. In the intervening days, as the media circled, the state authorities insisted everything was done properly. They claimed the cremation was legal, that the family gave permission, and that forensic reports did not support rape charges. The victim's family and human rights groups denied it, alleging that the authorities had tried to erase evidence, suppress dissent, and control the narrative. This case is not an anomaly. It is a full-throated alarm, sounding out the paradoxes that define India today. On one hand, India is a burgeoning global power. Its economy outstrips that of the United Kingdom, France, even Russia. It is the world's most populous nation. It draws pilgrims and tourists to its sacred rivers, to its beach towns in Goa, to ancient temples and spiritual seekers. India is, in many ways, a tale of aspiration, innovation, and ambition. But beneath that ascent lies an older, darker architecture, a system that still casts millions into rigid hierarchies, coercing lives into predetermined tracks. That system is caste, a system that dares to whisper in every village and city, "You know your place, and know it well." To the Dalit woman in Hathras, the promise of modern India offered little protection against a violence that had long been normalized, the violence of untouchability, social exclusion, silence, and structural impunity. In that moment, India's glaring contradictions, its soaring skyscrapers and its hidden gutters, its startup boom and its stagnant schools in remote hamlets, all converged in the body of one young woman. She became, unwillingly, a symbol of those whom the system ignores, of those whose cries the system muffles. Her cremation in the dead of night was not just an act of haste. It was a stark message. The machinery of caste will protect its own. Today, as we begin this journey through the long story of caste in India, how it came to be, how it persists, and whether there can ever be genuine rupture, we must keep the Hathras case in view. It reminds us that history is not just in the past. It breathes in every courtroom, in every village, in every law enforcement agency, in every social taboo. This is not a mere tale of crime and punishment. It is the opening of a larger reckoning, an inquiry into how a civilization that claims spiritual depth and democratic ideals can also harbor centuries-old structures of exclusion. The story ahead will trace how caste defines birth, occupation, social space, marriage, food, even destiny itself. We will see how colonialism hardened caste, how reformers fought it, and how the struggle continues in the present. For any story that wishes to confront India's future must begin here, with that young Dalit woman whose name might not always be spoken, whose pain was huge, and whose ordeal echoes in the lives of millions. This is not merely a chapter in India's history. It is the breach in its moral foundation, the crack in its promise of equality. As we move forward, remember, this is not abstract. These are real lives. And in understanding this disturbing introduction, we begin to understand how India's paradox, the grand and the brutal, the aspiration and the cruelty, is woven into every layer of its society. 1 in every 5 human beings alive today was born into the vast labyrinth of the caste system. That means more than 1 billion people live their lives along invisible lines drawn centuries ago, lines that still determine who they are allowed to be, where they can go, and how others will treat them. To speak of caste is to speak not of an ancient relic, but of a structure that quietly governs the daily existence of millions, often in ways outsiders find almost impossible to imagine. For many, caste dictates life from the very first breath. A surname can reveal social rank. A village address can betray hierarchy. Even the choice of food may signal purity or pollution in the eyes of others. A child born into a high caste might inherit privilege like an heirloom, better schools, cleaner neighborhoods, connections to power. A child born into a low caste or outside the hierarchy entirely inherits stigma, barriers, and often the silent knowledge that opportunities are rationed long before they arrive at the doorstep. This is the enduring shadow of caste, a system that orders society with mathematical precision, yet leaves countless lives fractured. Marriage remains tightly policed. Families scrutinize potential spouses for signs of caste purity, and even in urban India, matrimonial websites filter candidates by caste as readily as by education or salary. Diet is another arena. In some households, even today, the touch of food prepared by someone from a lower caste is considered polluting, a contamination that requires ritual cleansing. Work, too, is predetermined. Certain professions have been passed down like chains across generations, binding communities to labor others would never touch. It is difficult for those outside India to grasp the depth of this order, partly because it hides in plain sight. To many foreigners, India appears as a paradox, a land of software engineers and space missions, Bollywood stars, and bustly yoga retreats. Its international relationships grow more prominent, including deepening ties with Russia and economic partnerships that stretch across the globe. Yet few of those who engage with modern India understand that behind the scenes, every handshake, every business transaction, every political maneuver is filtered through a cultural structure older than empires. Even in diaspora communities far from South Asia, caste shadows stretch long. Indian immigrants have carried these identities with them to London, Toronto, Silicon Valley. There have been lawsuits in American tech companies over caste discrimination. In Britain, Dalit groups campaign for legal protections against prejudice within their own diaspora. The system, rooted in South Asia, has proven disturbingly portable, a kind of social software embedded so deeply it runs even when transplanted into new soil. At its heart, caste is not simply about individual prejudice. It is a collective architecture built and maintained over centuries that sorts people into categories of purity and pollution, privilege and exclusion. It is not easily dismantled because it is not just a social custom, but a worldview. For those who grow up within it, caste often feels natural, as if the rules of hierarchy were as immutable as the laws of gravity. A Brahmin priest might believe his ritual superiority is divinely ordained. A Dalit worker might be told from birth that their suffering is the price of sins committed in another life. The endurance of caste lies in this fatalism, in the way spiritual belief fuses with social order to create a self-sustaining system. Even when laws are passed to outlaw discrimination, the old patterns adapt and reassert themselves. Violence against Dalits, exclusion from temples or schools, subtle but cutting remarks in workplaces, all are reminders that hierarchy does not vanish just because constitutions declare equality. Yet to frame India solely as a land of oppression would be misleading. It is also a nation in rebellion against these shackles. From grassroots Dalit movements in villages to university protests in Delhi, there is an ongoing struggle to break caste apart. The endurance of caste is matched by the endurance of resistance. But to understand the battlefield of today, one must first recognize the colossal reach of the system. It has survived empires, conquests, colonialism, globalization. It has outlasted kingdoms and democracies alike, adapting like a chameleon to each new age. The outside world rarely sees this. Tourists marvel at the Taj Mahal or sip tea in Kerala without noticing the quiet divisions at their host's table. Business delegations meet Indian counterparts without realizing that their counterparts' access to English medium schooling, to elite universities, and to political clout often rests on centuries of inherited privilege. Global headlines often celebrate India's rise as the world's most populous democracy, its leaps in digital innovation, its growing voice in global affairs. What they rarely mention is that beneath the surface of these triumphs lies a social architecture that marks 1/5 of humanity with an invisible stamp at birth. This is the paradox of caste as a global phenomenon. It is intensely local, rooted in the soil of Indian villages and temples, yet it has consequences that ripple across continents. It shapes not only who fetches water in a rural hamlet, but also who writes code in a Californian office. It influences marriages arranged in Mumbai and weddings celebrated in London. It lives in whispers, in jokes, in silences, in rituals, in bureaucratic forms, and in acts of violence that occasionally explode into global news. The Hathras tragedy was one such explosion, forcing the world to look at what many prefer not to see. But that was only one case among thousands. Every day, quietly, the shadow persists. Understanding that shadow is essential, not only to grasp the contradictions of India, but to recognize how deeply caste is interwoven with global modernity itself. It is not only India's burden, it is humanity's mirror, reflecting the ways in which we all, in different guises, construct hierarchies and enforce them. In the next step of this journey, the question must be asked, what exactly is caste? To name it, to define it, is already to wrestle with its complexity. Before dismantling the edifice, we must first see its design. Professional definitions of caste are surprisingly slippery. Though people try hard, there is no single, perfect way to pin it down. In this chapter, we'll dig into what caste is, how it works, and why even experts struggle to describe it fully. To begin, caste is both a theoretical concept and a lived reality. It's a social ordering system that defines who you are by birth, your family, your lineage, and prescribes many elements of your life: who you marry, what work you do, how you eat, where you live. But caste isn't static. It shifts over time, across regions, and with political, religious, and economic changes. One of the first challenges is defining what caste really means. In India, Jati is the term most often used for the thousands of hereditary, endogamous, meaning marriage within the group, birth groups. Varna refers to an older, idealized classification: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, more prominent in religious texts. Many scholars point out that Varna is more of a framework, whereas Jatis are what people actually live by, locally. Even among Indian scholars and Indologists, people who study Indian history, culture, languages, there is debate. How many Jatis are there? How binding are their rules? How fixed is caste behavior? What about intersection with class, religion, politics? On scale, there are over 3,000 Jatis recognized in various studies and surveys across India. In certain estimates, when you count subcastes, smaller groups under Jatis, often regionally unique, the figure could run well into the tens of thousands. These subcastes often differ by region, language, occupation history, ritual status, etc. Because of this diversity, caste identity is highly local. A Jati that's upper in prestige in one village might be less so in another. Social ranking isn't uniform across India. What are the core elements that most definitions include? Here are the features that reappear in nearly every serious description of caste. 1. Birth heredity. One is born into a caste. This ascribed status generally cannot be changed by personal achievement, though people sometimes try. More on that later. 2. Endogamy. Marriage tends to be within the caste or Jati. Outsiders are usually excluded, formally or informally. 3. Occupational or functional specialization. Historically, many Jatis were associated with particular occupations: farmers, priests, weavers, cleaners, etc., often inherited across generations. Though in modern times, many people diverge from those traditional roles. 4. Hierarchy, ritual status. Some castes are socially and ritually higher or lower. Higher castes are, or were, often those with claims to purity, religious learning, or proximity to religious power. Lower castes, or those considered polluting, had restricted rights or duties seen as undesirable by others. 5. Purity, pollution ideas. Ritual notions about clean versus unclean play a big role in differentiating castes, especially in traditional settings. What is acceptable food? Whose touch is defiling? Who may enter certain sacred places? All these can be shaped by caste. But none of those features fully capture caste by itself. Some Jatis deviate from one or more. For example, a Jati might have lost its traditional occupation, or people move into urban areas and marry outside in practice, if not socially. Some castes have adopted or dropped ritual restrictions depending on region and historical pressure. Historical texts introduce Varna, the four-part division, as a kind of cosmic ordering, mythologically linked with gods, duty, dharma, and social roles. But on the ground, most people identify with Jatis, Their everyday life follows Jati rules more than Varna ideals. Varna gives a schema. Jati does the real work of ordering society. Another wrinkle: caste is not only among Hindus. Even in religious communities theoretically outside the Hindu fold, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, many people retain caste identities. That shows that caste is not simply a religious doctrine, but a social structure deeply embedded in family, culture, economy, and tradition. Because of all these qualifiers, definitions always need caveats. Region matters. What caste means in a village in Tamil Nadu can be quite different from Uttar Pradesh or in urban Mumbai versus remote areas. The influence of law, politics, activism, etc. modifies how rigid caste behavior is. Discrimination is illegal, affirmative action exists. Still, social norms, local power, and prejudice often persist outside what laws can completely control. Social mobility is uneven. Some Jatis have managed, over time, to change their status via wealth, political power, or by emulating higher castes. But there are many structural obstacles to that. In summary, caste is a system built on birth and community, ordering people in a hierarchy of status, ritual purity, and occupation, mediated through marriage and everyday rules. Its scale is massive, thousands of jatis, and its shape is varied. Because of its deep entanglement with religion, economics, regional history, and politics, no single definition captures every facet. This complexity makes caste both powerful and difficult to dismantle. The contours of caste are always changing, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply, but its roots go deep. The foundations of caste rest on 5 defining features, pillars that have held the system upright for centuries across villages, cities, and dynasties. These features are not merely abstract rules. They have shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people, guiding how they marry, eat, work, and even think about themselves. Understanding them is crucial to grasping why caste is so resilient and why it continues to exert such influence despite centuries of reform and resistance. The first pillar is heredity. Caste status is not chosen, nor is it earned. It is assigned at the moment of birth and carried for life. A child born into a Brahmana household will be recognized as high caste before taking its first steps, while one born to Dalit parents inherits their stigma without a single deed to warrant it. Surnames themselves often act as signposts of caste, signaling to others a person's origin and status. For example, Gandhi is historically tied to the Banya or merchant caste, although the name now carries far greater associations because of Mahatma Gandhi. This inheritance operates like an invisible stamp, branding generations in ways that education, wealth, or migration have only partly been able to erase. In a society where identity is inscribed in bloodlines, escaping that mark has historically been nearly impossible. The second pillar is professional division. Traditionally, each caste was tied to a particular occupation, also passed from father to son, mother to daughter, generation after generation. Priests performed rituals, warriors defended kingdoms, farmers tilled the soil, merchants traded, artisans crafted, and sweepers cleaned the streets. Even professions considered degrading, such as leatherwork, associated with handling dead animals, were tied firmly to particular castes. This arrangement created both stability and suffocation. Stability because every person had a role in the social machine, but suffocation because there was no freedom to pursue a life outside one's inherited occupation. Priests, scholars, and teachers, collectively the Brahmanas, have historically occupied the highest rung, considered guardians of ritual purity and knowledge. They were not merely spiritual guides, but also wielders of immense social influence. Below them stood the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers who controlled kingdoms and armies. Vaishyas, the merchants and farmers, occupied the middle. Shudras, the laborers and servants, stood at the bottom of the recognized Varna system. Outside it altogether were the Untouchables, later called Dalits, whose very presence was once considered polluting. This hierarchy extended beyond temples and rituals. It shaped access to land, wealth, education, and political power. Even today, high caste families are disproportionately represented among India's wealthiest elites and in senior government positions, while lower castes remain overrepresented in poverty statistics. The fourth pillar is endogamy, the rule that marriage must take place strictly within one's caste. In practice, this rule has been among the most fiercely guarded. The idea of love across caste lines has long been treated as dangerous, even subversive, because it threatens to blur boundaries that keep the hierarchy intact. Romantic tales of intercaste couples often echo the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, but with deadly real-world consequences. Social ostracism, violent reprisals, and in extreme cases, honor killings sanctioned by families or communities. Marriage is not merely a union of two individuals in this system. It is the defense of collective identity, purity, and control. In rural areas, village councils have historically enforced these rules with ruthless discipline, while in cities, families maintain the same through arranged marriages. Love that dares to cross caste lines remains one of the sharpest challenges to the system's survival. The fifth pillar is diet, an often overlooked but deeply significant feature of caste. Food is not simply sustenance in India. It is a marker of purity, faith, and status. High castes, particularly Brahmanas, traditionally adhere to strict vegetarianism, seeing it as a moral and spiritual discipline that elevates them above those who consume meat. In contrast, many lower castes who have historically engaged in hard manual labor eat meat to sustain themselves, though beef has been singled out as forbidden in Hindu tradition. These dietary distinctions create invisible barriers in daily life. Who can cook for whom? Whose food can be shared? Whose water can be touched? A Brahmana family might refuse to eat food prepared by a Shudra household, believing it spiritually tainted. Yet these rules were never absolute. Vegetarianism is not a blanket mandate in Hinduism or Buddhism. Rather, it is an ideal that many aspire to, but not all follow. Even in modern India, food remains a contested terrain. Chicken curry may have conquered the world as one of the country's most famous dishes, but within India, what one eats can still reveal and reinforce caste identity. These 5 features, heredity, occupation, hierarchy, endogamy, and diet, together form the skeleton of the caste system. Each pillar reinforces the others, locking individuals into a web of inherited duties, restrictions, and identities. If you are born into a caste, your occupation is already chosen. Your social status is fixed. Your marriage options are policed, and even your meals are subject to scrutiny. These rules have been resilient not because they are simple, but because they are embedded in every sphere of life, from the intimate act of cooking to the public exercise of governance. Understanding these pillars also illuminates why the system has been so hard to dismantle. Each feature creates a feedback loop. A child inherits caste, grows up with limited opportunities, marries within the same boundaries, and raises children who repeat the cycle. Even when education, reform, or law offer escape routes, the weight of tradition, family, and community expectation pulls people back in. The persistence of these features shows that caste is not just an abstract social structure. It is lived reality, replicated daily in habits, choices, and customs. And yet, these same pillars have also been points of resistance. Breaking dietary rules, choosing a partner across caste lines, rejecting traditional occupations, or refusing to honor caste surnames, all these acts have been forms of rebellion, however small. They challenge the invisible scaffolding that keeps caste upright. The endurance of the system and the courage of those who resist it show that caste is not a relic of the past, but a contested force shaping the present. Each pillar is both a prison wall and, for those who dare to defy it, a line of battle. In the beginning, Hindu mythology teaches the universe arose from Purusha, the cosmic being or primordial man. Out of Purusha's body emerged the Varnas, the great four divisions of social order. These are not merely arbitrary classes, but sacred, symbolic, and, for many adherents, divinely ordained. According to the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, one of the oldest Hindu texts, Brahmins were born from his mouth, Kshatriyas from his arms, Vaishyas from his thighs, and Shudras from his feet. Each Varna corresponds to a different function, capacity, and role within society. These four, the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, are the backbone of the Varna system. The Brahmanas represent the intellectual and spiritual elite, priests, scholars, ritual specialists. They are those dedicated to meditation, scripture, learning, and sustaining religious traditions. Next come the Kshatriyas, the arms of society, warriors, rulers, protectors, those entrusted with enforcing dharma, moral law, and defending the people. Third are the Vaishyas, the thighs, farmers, merchants, artisans, business people, those who provide for material sustenance and commerce. Finally, the Shudras, the feet, service providers, laborers, everyday workers, whose toil in agriculture, domestic work, manual craft, and support roles enables the rest to function. The mythology of origin assigns to each Varna not only role but status. The mouth, Brahmin, is the source of speech, sacred utterance, wisdom, speaking truth, teaching, performing ritual. Hands, Kshatriya, wield power and force. Thighs, Vaishya, carry weight and supply. Feet, Shudra, serve, support, touch the ground, do the work others consider lower. The symbolism is strong. Those closer to the head are often considered closer to purity, holiness, authority. Those at the feet are seen as service, objection, physical contact, toil. It is important to see that in many classical texts, these divisions were seen as natural and virtuous. Each part has its place, each function is necessary. The Varna system also carries a divine logic. These divisions stem from cosmic necessity. The creator god Brahma, or Purusha, does not generate any quality merely for oppression, according to the myth. Rather, each Varna is said to have emerged from a different part of Purusha's body, symbolizing interdependence. Even the lowest, the Shudras, are born from the same being. That is, in mythic form, all are connected. The divisions are functional rather than purely despotic in origin. In later texts, the myth is elaborated, sometimes interpreted differently, and often used to justify social stratification. Varna becomes not just a mythic origin, but a lived condition. Hereditary in many cases, hierarchical in status, restrictive in movement. The sacred literature, like the Manusmriti and Dharmashastras, reinforce the idea that one is born into a Varna, with prescribed duties, dharma, and social expectations. Some early texts and scholars argue that Varna was intended as more fluid than later practice made it. In texts like the Mahabharata and in the Upanishads, there are reflections on character, guna, action, karma, and duty, qualities that sometimes conflict with birth alone. But over time, myth plus ritual plus political power combined to make Varna into a more fixed system, especially at the local Jati level. The mythic origin, the cosmic body of Purusha, remains powerful for understanding how ancient Indians conceived of the cosmos: order, purpose, sanctity. The idea that the social world is interconnected, each person having a role, that status comes with duty, was central. However, mythology is only one piece of the framework. It gives legitimacy, it shapes belief, it underpins ritual purity ideas, it shapes law. Yet, even within this mythic origin, questions have long been raised. What does born from the mouth or thighs mean in a real society? Are these metaphors or prescriptions? Do they justify hierarchy, or are they to be understood in spiritual terms? Ancient debates already suggest that some saw Varna not strictly as birth, but also as character and behavior. Even Purusha Sukta, some scholars argue, may have been inserted later in the Vedic corpus to systematize or justify divisions that were already developing. As we move forward, the import is this. The myth of Purusha establishes that Varna was conceived as both cosmic and moral architecture. It is meant to map the seen and unseen world. It provides the language, the symbols, the structure for what comes next, how caste as lived reality will enforce, complicate, and distort the myth. And it sets up deep tension between myth and practice, between spiritual ideal and social reality, between what is said and what is done. They live in shadows, outside the four Varnas. They are called the Avarnas, the Untouchables, or Dalits. Their existence in India's caste order is defined not just by role or birth, but by what is considered ritually impure. In the system of purity and pollution, ritual matters. Physical cleanliness, spiritual cleanliness, who touches whom, who eats what, who enters where. For many people across castes, being pure is essential, especially for those whose job is to perform ritual or worship. For Dalits, many of whose assigned tasks are deemed polluting, the purity code means everyday exclusion and dehumanization. Dalit groups traditionally perform the tasks judged most defiling: handling human waste, cleaning drains, working in sewers, disposing of dead bodies or dead animals, all so other castes do not touch impurity. Skinning animals, tanning hides, removing carcasses, sweeping streets, cleaning latrines. These are not chosen, but imposed duties. They are hereditary, almost never voluntary or optional. Because of what these jobs involve, Dalits are thought of by upper castes as contagious in ritual terms. Even indirect contact, touch, shadow, sharing water or food utensils can be seen as contaminating. If a high caste person comes into contact with a Dalit, or even if a Dalit's shadow falls on them, there are prescribed acts, purification rituals, sometimes bathing, abstaining, cleansing. The physical infrastructure of exclusion is everywhere. Dalits have often been forced to live on the outskirts of villages or in segregated hamlets. Separate wells, separate water taps, separate temples, or no temple access at all. There are places where Dalits must use separate utensils, drink from separate glasses, eat food prepared with strict distance. In some villages, even walking on paths that cross through upper caste areas can be restricted. Discrimination extends into public life. Dalits may be banned from entering certain sections of temples, from certain schools, from public functions, or even from using restaurants or public businesses that non-Dalits frequent. Where legal action has tried to reduce these practices, customary behavior often lags behind law. Ritual purity also shapes family and social ceremonies. At weddings, festivals, births, deaths, whenever ritual is present, Dalits are either excluded or forced into roles considered menial. For death rituals, Dalits themselves often must conduct burials or cremations, yet they are not allowed to perform the mainstream rites conducted by Brahmin priests. In mourning periods, Dalit mourners may be isolated, forbidden from cooking food for others, or entering sacred spaces. The idea of being polluted is not just symbolic. It carries stigma, economic exclusion, health burdens. Many Dalits work with their bodies in environments where sanitation, safety, and dignity are absent. Manual scavenging, clearing severed human waste from latrines or septic tanks, is still practiced in parts of India, often without protective gear or rights. These are not just jobs, they are markers that the rest of society treat as shameful. Despite the severity, Dalits themselves are not monolithic. Within Dalit communities, there are internal hierarchies. Some subgroups are considered less impure than others. The logic of purity pollution, adopted by higher castes, also seeps into how Dalits see each other. Some Dalits may refuse to accept the pollution of those considered below them, especially during ritual events. Religions, laws, and reform movements have repeatedly challenged these norms. Constitutional protections in India outlaw untouchability. Scheduled castes receive legal recognition and affirmative action. But legality does not erase deeply embedded social beliefs. The ritual imagination, what people believe about touch, about impurity, moves slower than policy. In the end, the Dalits' place outside the four Varnas reveals how the mythic and the mundane are knitted tightly in caste society. The high caste's fear of pollution enforces boundaries. The ritual logic of purity and pollution sanctions exclusion, and Dalits live with the consequences of being other in a system that claims all are born equal before the divine. Yet even in exclusion, there is resistance. In asserting dignity, contesting prohibitions, claiming temple entry, raising legal challenges, composing art and literature that refuse shame. Their struggle makes visible what caste means not just in myth, not just in theory, but in every well denied, every ritual forbidden, every touch refused. A life born under the caste system is like a book whose chapters are already written before you can pick up the pen. From your first breath until your last rites, nearly everything rides on where in the hierarchy your birth falls. Inequality and fatalism are not side effects, they are baked into the mechanism. Chapter 7 exposes that mechanism, how caste perpetuates inequality and shapes destinies, not by chance, but by design. People are born into fixed roles. The identity you inherit at birth, a Jati, a caste, a Varna, is more than a label. It's a script for your whole life. Your work, your status, how others treat you, the expectations people have, these are set before you even understand them. A Dalit is born into jobs considered polluting, forced to do the hardest labor, excluded from centers of power. A Brahmin is born privy to ritual, taught the sacred texts, rewarded with prestige and authority. These divisions are not optional. They are enforced, sometimes brutally. Marriage is a boundary wall. Love or desire across caste lines is taboo, often violently discouraged. Endogamy, marrying within one's caste, is one of the system's strongest pillars. Breaking this rule isn't just frowned upon, it threatens the hierarchy. A caste is meant to stay pure, untouched by other castes, so that inequality is preserved. Through marriage, the blood, the lineage, the inherited status stays locked in. If people begin crossing those lines, the walls of the structure tremble. Occupation is another chain. Hereditary professions mean you rarely choose your job. The baker's child bakes, the manual scavenger cleans, the scholar studies texts. In some places, people might try to emulate higher castes, learn new skills, change their surnames, but such acts risk social ostracism, economic retaliation, loss of community support. The system is built to discourage ambition across caste lines. Its invisible sticks and stones punish deviation. Geography and proximity also enforce caste. Lower castes are structurally pushed to the outskirts, on the edge of villages, denied access to common wells, temples, schools, and public infrastructure. Upper castes inhabit the center. The spatial distance isn't just physical, it is experiential. To be outside is to live with fewer opportunities, less dignity. To be inside, privileged access, better safety, better visibility. Ritual purity and pollution add weight. Every interaction between castes carries invisible rules. A higher caste person might be polluted by a slave or Dalit's touch, requiring purification rituals. These rigid purity codes maintain distance, literally and metaphorically, between groups. They encode fear, fear of being tainted, fear of contamination, fear of moral and social impurity. That fear justifies exclusion, humiliation, avoidance, norms that become internalized by both oppressor and oppressed. Fatalism is the emotional gravity that keeps the system unbroken. The idea that suffering is deserved, karma in religious terms, means many internalize the belief that if you are born underprivileged, it's your past lives catching up with you. Ambedkar and others criticized this doctrine. When the powerless believe their chains are their own doing, resistance becomes harder. Faith in punishment or reward in another life can damp immediate social protest, because the promise of one day in the next birth substitutes for change now. But inequality isn't just spiritual or social, it's economic. Land, education, jobs, all tied to caste. Historically, upper castes accumulated land and wealth, often benefiting from colonial favoritism and traditional privilege. Lower castes were locked into labor relationships like the Judgmani system, performing essential but stigmatized services to upper castes for minimal compensation, often with no possibility of rising outside those roles. Economic dependence enforces obedience. Without land, credit, education, mobility, deviation is risky. Colonial and then post-colonial legal structures often froze caste identities. British census efforts classified castes rigidly, mapping Jatis into fixed hierarchies for administrative convenience. What before had shades of regional variation, shifting lines, some ambiguity, after bureaucratic classification became this caste is high, that caste is low, and that became what people believed, and what courts, jobs, quotas, and society at large enforced. Rigid definitions allowed the system to persist into modern times as official, visible inequality rather than something only maintained by custom. Fatalism is also systemic inertia. When everyone from birth is taught or shown that certain things are out of reach, the cost of trying to cross barriers is high. You risk social isolation, economic loss, even violence. So many oppressed groups resist, and yet many adapt, survive, find identity inside subcastes, or build communities of resistance. But transforming the whole system is harder than changing one person's life. Yet history shows things weren't always so rigid. Before the full weight of colonial rule, before modern administrative systems, caste identities had more flexibility, regional variations, fluidity in social status, more possibility of moving up or down. But what we see today is the persistence of that organism, now reinforced by legal codes, politics, social expectations, commercial systems, modern education, but often available mostly to higher castes, reinforcing existing fault lines. The purpose of caste inequality is not merely tradition, it is control. It ensures that power, wealth, privilege remain concentrated. It keeps many people too busy surviving to ask why the rules are like this. It maintains the hierarchy by making it unavoidable, by embedding it in everyday life. In sum, caste isn't just about hierarchy, it's about destiny. It demarcates who you get to marry, what you learn, where you live, what you eat, what jobs you can hold, what dreams you are allowed to nurture. Inequality and fatalism are not glitches, they are the system's design. And understanding this mechanism is essential if change is to be more than surface deep. Belief in karma and reincarnation is more than religious doctrine in India. It's the engine that keeps caste alive. These philosophies don't just explain why things are the way they are. They justify, normalize, and enforce the hierarchy. They tell people that their place in the system is deserved, or at least inevitable. Karma, in its simplest sense, means action and its moral consequences. Every action, small or large, visible or unseen, leaves an imprint. Over multiple lifetimes, these imprints aggregate. Good deeds bring good results, negative deeds bring suffering. Reincarnation, or rebirth, means the soul is born again in a new body, carrying forward some of those past imprints. What you experienced in an earlier life shapes what and who you become in your next. In traditional Hindu thought, this process is called samsara. The ultimate aim, moksha, is liberation, escape from the cycle of rebirth. How does that link with caste? The system uses karma and reincarnation as ideological glue. A person born into a higher caste is taught to believe this is due to good karma in past lives. Being born into a marginalized caste, or born Dalit, untouchable, is often explained as the consequence of bad karma. This belief imposes a moral dimension onto inequality. It suggests that suffering and exclusion are not arbitrary or solely the result of human injustice, but are connected to cosmic moral order. For many, this becomes self-regulation. The hope of a better next life encourages obedience, discourages rebellion. Why risk challenging caste norms when doing so might be seen as resisting karma? The fear of negative future rebirths, or worse, makes many internalize their place. It leads to fatalism, believing that your suffering is preordained, that protest or social mobility is not just difficult, but spiritually unwise. Texts and philosophical traditions lay out more detailed mechanics. For example, doctrine distinguishes among different kinds of karma. One kind is accumulated karmas from past lives, called sanchita karma. Another is that portion which ripens in this life, prarabdha, to shape current circumstances, and another kind is karma we generate right now, affecting possible futures. Thus, someone born into suffering is often seen as living out past prarabdha karma. Even as they act in this life, their possibilities are constrained by what past lives have seeded. Important critiques point out that this system of blame, of past lives determining current caste, lets the powerful off the hook. If you're poor, excluded, discriminated against, the karma explanation shifts responsibility away from the social, economic, and political structures that perpetuate inequality. It reduces systemic injustice to spiritual destiny. Many reformers, including B.R. Ambedkar, rejected this. They saw the doctrine of karma, as used popularly, not as neutral, but deeply harmful when used to justify oppression. Ambedkar himself was raised among Dalits, and he challenged these sacred norms. Also, the idea of karma is sometimes more fluid in philosophical or religious texts than its social application. Some Hindu thinkers argue that true karma doesn't rigidly tie you to birth status. In some interpretations, merit, knowledge, moral character, even devotion can transcend caste. But the popular, lived belief often blurs those nuances. One's caste by birth is treated as evidence of past lives, not something to be questioned too sharply. Moreover, belief in karma and reincarnation intersects with rituals, social institutions, festivals, everyday morality. It shapes education, moral teachings that stress fulfilling your prescribed social role, dharma, even if it's unjust. It shapes law and custom, caste codes about purity, food, marriage, because violating them is seen not just as breaking social norms, but accruing bad karma. In sum, karma and reincarnation do more than explain why people are born where they are. They enforce acceptance. They lower resistance. They provide an imagined ladder. Maybe next life I'll be born higher. That keeps many people hoping instead of fighting. If caste is the architecture of inequality, karma and reincarnation are the cement that holds its bricks together. They make the system feel both inevitable and sacred, a powerful combination. A person is born into a Jati, a heritable, localized, intimate social group, and that Jati becomes the frame of their identity. Who they can marry, what work they do, where they live, whom they accept food or water from, even with whom they share rituals. This chapter explains how the ancient Varna ideal, 4 broad classes, evolved into the rich, tangled, thousand-strong reality of Jatis, and how those tightly woven communities both sustain people and limit them. Jati literally means birth or lineage, and the term exists in almost every Indian language. It refers to the thousands of clans, tribes, subcastes, religious communities, or occupational lineages whose membership is ascribed at birth, not achieved. Though ancient texts talk about Varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, those categories were rather abstract, broad glosses over social distinction. In daily life, very few people actually lived according to just those 4 slots. Real society was stratified into Jatis, thousands of them, each with its own rules, status, expectations. How many Jatis are there? Estimates vary, but anthropological work suggests there are more than 3,000 Jatis across India. Some sources say over 3,000, possibly many more once you count very localized subgroups. Each region, each village even, has its own pattern. Which Jatis are dominant, which are low status, which have floating boundaries, which are recognized formally versus informally. The precise number in one district may be far lower than the total across all India. What does a Jati actually do? A Jati is more than just identity. It functions in multiple overlapping ways. Occupational community. Many, though not all, Jatis are historically tied to particular trades: blacksmiths, potters, barbers, shepherds, weavers, etc. One is born into that trade, learns it in the family, and often spends life doing or being socially tied to it. Social safety net. Within a Jati, there's mutual support. Relatives, neighbors, people of your Jati help in emergencies. In rural life, informal credit, help with farming, social rituals, mourning, marriage, these are things the Jati organizes or assists with. If the outside state or institutions fail you, much of one's trust falls on one's Jati. Extended family and community. The Jati is often the extended family, not just literal kin, but kin in community. There are norms, rituals, shared festivals, rules about purity, manners, interaction, food sharing. Sometimes a Jati has its own council or elders who enforce rules, who qualifies for membership, who violates norms, who is excluded. Foundational to a Jati is endogamy, marriage within the Jati. Rarely do people cross Jati lines in marrying. This keeps the boundaries firm in caste, in ritual status, social interaction. It also means that Jatis are genetically, socially, culturally distinct in many localities. Beyond marriage, there is spatial and ritual segregation. High-status Jatis often occupy the center of villages or towns. Low-status ones may live on the periphery, sometimes physically separate quarters or in worse housing. Higher Jatis are more likely to be served by local temples, control religious life more visibly. Lower Jatis often have less access to shared water sources, less voice in local power, or must accept purity rules, who they can touch, whose water they can drink, etc. Although many aspects of Jati are rigid, they are not entirely static. Historically and today, Jatis have attempted to raise their status. There is a sociological process called Sanskritization, by which a lower Jati emulates the rituals, lifestyle, often name, and claims of a higher Jati in order to gain prestige. Examples: changing names, adopting vegetarianism, changing dress codes, and trying to be recognized socially by other Jatis. Over time, some such attempts succeed, but mobility is usually limited. It's hard for individuals from low or oppressed Jatis to break through. The rules of ritual purity and pollution are strong, local memory is long, power is controlled socially. Legal equality does exist, but social equality lags behind. The structure of Jati means that even where laws allow intercaste marriage, many families resist. Even when people move geographically, they are often still judged by their surnames, by local community expectations. For many people, Jati isn't a philosophical category. It's the daily reality: who they can trust, where they eat, how others treat them, what jobs they aspire to or can realistically get, whether they can rent in certain areas, even whether they face indignities in public life. Imagine a village with 10 Jatis, a dominant landlord Jati, 1 or 2 mid-ranking artisanal Jatis, some service Jatis, some extremely low-status ones who do the untouchable work. The dominant Jati wields social, economic, and political power. They control the land, perhaps control who sits on the local council, who gets jobs with government benefits, and often even who gets invited to temple rituals. Lower Jatis may have to walk farther for water. Their children may go to lower quality schools, face discrimination in markets, in public transport, etc. Varna is a kind of moral or religious framework, often taught in sacred texts. But Jati is what one wakes up inside, the distinction between ideal and practice. While Varna is taught as the fourfold divine order, Jati is how caste lives, breathes, rules and punishes, rewards, nurtures, and confines. Because Jati is local, granular, lived, it adapts. It redefines itself, changes its hierarchies, sometimes shifts status, sometimes merges with political identity, sometimes with language identity. Varna is too high level. Jati is where the power, the suffering, the solidarity, the hope occur. Some Jatis have lost their traditional occupations. Modernization, economic change, migration have disrupted the old patterns. A person born into a Jati of blacksmiths might today work in tech or business. But social stigma or expectations or prejudice often still attach. The name, the network, the history still carries force. Also, with urbanization, inter-Jati boundaries may blur. One's Jati may matter less in the city or matter differently. Yet in elections, in politics, in local identities, Jati remains powerful. Also, legal frameworks often treat caste at the Varna level or use broad categories: scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, rather than recognizing every Jati. That means many specific experiences are hidden. In that sense, Jatis are both communities of survival and engines of division. They offer belonging, structure, identity, but also walls, invisible cages. Their thousand-fold stratification is essential to understand how caste is not just belief or text, but the lived texture of millions of lives. There was a time before British enumeration, before caste was fossilized into legal boxes, when possibilities, even if narrow, still flickered between the lines. The caste order was harsh, exclusionary, and brutal for many. Yet for some, especially among the non-untouchables, the system contained cracks, loopholes, social strategies, reinvention that allowed movement, redefinition, even escape of a kind. In that older world, a man born to a lower Jati might over centuries find himself reclassified, claiming a loftier status or marrying into a more honored line. These were fragile gains, always contested, but they remind us that the system was not always as rigid as it later became. The idea of caste has deep roots, but the caste system as we know it was shaped in part by history, by culture, by political forces. As villages grew into towns, trade multiplied, kingdoms expanded and fragmented, people moved, mixed, and adapted. In that flux, the caste order could not remain static. To survive, many Jatis developed internal flexibility. Some rules could be bent, alliances could be formed, change could be sought. One of the clearest paths toward upward mobility was Sanskritization. Coined by the sociologist M.N. Srinivas, Sanskritization describes what many lower or middle Jatis did: emulate the behaviors, rituals, dress, diet, practices of higher status castes, especially Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. Adopt vegetarianism, adopt temperance, adopt purity rules, take up new rituals, change one's caste name or genealogical claims. Little by little, across 1 or 2 generations, the community might demand recognition at a higher rung. This was not a guarantee, but it offered a pathway. In many cases, Sanskritization depended on having enough influence, enough wealth, or connections to persuade others to accept the claim. The more prestige, resources, literacy you had, the more weight your aspirational Jati commanded. Historians find Sanskritization across India, in tribal communities, artisan groups, pastoral groups, all trying to assert higher rank by ritual means and social mimicry. Sanskritization did not overturn caste, it did not abolish hierarchy. What it sought was upward repositioning within the hierarchy, shifting from lower to less low, from artisan castes to semi-respectable caste status, from regional obscurity into recognized Jatis. Crucially, it required acceptance by other castes. The broader society had to accept the claims. Even if a Jati adopted Brahminical rituals, the dominant Jatis might resist, refuse intermarriage, or mock the pretension. Many Sanskritizing efforts ultimately failed, and often only those Jatis already somewhat advantaged, economically, geographically, or politically, had any realistic chance. Another mechanism for mobility was alliances with political power. Ruling dynasties, regional courts, local chieftains often needed skilled administrators, warriors, craftsmen, even intermediaries who could bridge between rulers and peasants. A Jati that supplied useful crafts, military service, administration, or tax collection might receive honors, titles, land grants. Over time, that Jati could be folded into higher status circles. Some Jatis gradually shifted their claimed genealogy to link themselves to mythic or royal ancestry. In some regions, groups absorbed immigrants or subgroups and rebranded themselves, asserting descent from a prestigious clan or lineage. The Rajput caste, for instance, in many areas, was not an immutable warrior class from antiquity, but a repositioning over centuries. Clans, local chiefs sometimes did genealogical engineering, joined into Rajput lines by claiming divine descent or alliance, and thereby gained status. The flexibility of memory, narrative, ritual became tools of mobility. Marriage offered another channel, albeit narrow. A Jati with rising status might secure marriage alliances with slightly higher Jatis, sometimes through hypergamy, marrying up, adopting prestige names, crafting origin myths that aligned with higher varieties. Young daughters from upward aspiring Jatis might be married into more respected families under auspicious circumstances, forging new linkages. Yet these moves were watched jealously. One's origin could always be recalled, and stigma could follow. The economic transformation of crafts, trade, commerce, markets also underpinned mobility. As new trades appeared, merchants, financiers, textile producers, salt workers, new crafts, all these allowed occupants of lower ritual rank to gain wealth. When wealth grows, someone can pay for priests, for rituals, for temples, for patronage. A formerly obscure artisan Jati might become rich enough to sponsor temples or festivals, opening new prestige. Town wealth and market exchanges eroded the old Jati occupation lock. The stigma of one's hereditary work less often dictated your livelihood when trade, migration, and enterprise offered alternatives. Yet, even in this pre-colonial dynamism, there were real limits. For untouchables, the margins were more sealed. Their exclusion was not just social, but ritual, spatial, symbolic. Barred from water sources, temples, crossing thresholds, touching upper caste persons. Sanskritization did little for them. The purity laws were too powerful, the stigma too ingrained. The untouchables were not just lower in ritual hierarchy, they were outside the boundary entirely. In many places, Jati's boundaries remained strong even as they tried to shift. Dominant castes policed them. Ritual grudges could rear up. A newly Sanskritizing Jati might be welcomed in some spheres, but denied in the most sacred ones. Denied entry to certain temples, denied access to certain shared rituals. The internal rules of caste enforced with discipline. Gossip, ostracism, refusal of social cooperation, religious sanctions. In some cases, these sanctions stopped mobility in its tracks. Yet, in the swirl of change, some new castes emerged. As cities formed, artisan and trader guilds crystallized, sometimes self-consciously claiming new identities. New Jatis invented origin stories, recruited to themselves migrants, claimed elevated rituals. Some regional castes reinvented themselves over centuries, capturing land and political roles, rewriting narratives, and gradually achieving recognition. The stratification of Jatis was never static, it was always shifting, contested. One must also note the interface between Jati mobility and ritual ideology. Sanskritization reinforced the religious narrative that if you behave like a Brahmana or follow purity rules, you must be worthy of higher ritual status. In doing so, it always buttressed caste itself. In other words, mobility came only by accepting the system's logic. Thus, the individual or Jati seeking change still worked within the logic of purity, pollution, hierarchy. When British rule arrived, the colonial state drew maps, enumerated castes, froze categories into law, built the census forms, tied identity into land and legal privileges. That modern rigidification dramatically narrowed the fluidity that had once existed. But the memory of movement, the techniques of Sanskritization, the claims and alliances remain part of Indian society's DNA. Those pre-colonial times remind us caste was not always cast in stone. The tunnels were narrower then, but there was motion. In understanding that motion, we glimpse possibilities, not just for past pathways, but for future ones. During the Mughal era, spanning from the early 16th to the mid-19th century, the caste system in India underwent significant transformations. While the Mughals did not invent the caste system, their policies and administrative structures influenced its evolution in profound ways. The Mughal Empire, established by Babur in 1526, expanded rapidly under rulers like Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. Akbar, in particular, is noted for his efforts to integrate diverse communities into the imperial framework. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, promoted religious tolerance, and encouraged marriages between Rajputs and Mughal nobility. This inclusivity extended to the military and administrative spheres, where individuals from various backgrounds, including Rajputs, Afghans, and even lower caste Hindus, served in significant positions. The Mansabdar system, introduced by Akbar, was a rank-based bureaucracy that did not rigidly adhere to caste lines, allowing for a more fluid integration of diverse groups into governance. Despite these progressive measures, the Mughal administration did not dismantle the existing caste structures. Instead, they incorporated them into the imperial system. For instance, land revenue records often listed individuals by their caste, reflecting the persistence of caste identities in administrative practices. Additionally, the Mughal nobility, known as the Mansabdars, came from diverse backgrounds, including Central Asians, Iranians, Afghans, and Indian Muslims, but caste considerations still played a role in their social standings. The Portuguese, arriving in India in the 15th century, were among the first Europeans to document the caste system. They used the term casta, derived from the Spanish word for race, to describe the social stratification they observed. This term was later anglicized to caste and became the standard nomenclature for the system. Their observations were limited, often focusing on the most visible aspects of caste, such as the treatment of Dalits, without fully understanding the complexities of the Varna and Jati systems. In the context of the Mughal Empire, the Portuguese influence was more about naming and categorizing than altering the social fabric. The Mughals, with their centralized bureaucracy and military prowess, maintained a more pragmatic approach to governance. While they recognized the importance of caste in local administration, they did not seek to reform or challenge the system. Instead, they adapted it to fit the imperial structure, ensuring that caste identities were preserved within the larger framework of Mughal rule. The coexistence of Mughal policies and Portuguese observations highlights the complex interplay between indigenous social structures and foreign influences. While the Mughals integrated caste into their administration, they did not impose a rigid racial ideology akin to European colonial powers. The Portuguese, on the other hand, viewed caste through a racialized lens, which influenced Western perceptions of Indian society. This divergence underscores the multifaceted nature of caste and its evolution under different rulers and foreign observers. In summary, the Mughal period was characterized by a pragmatic approach to the caste system, integrating it into the imperial framework without attempting to dismantle it. The Portuguese contributed to the nomenclature and external understanding of caste, but did not significantly alter its internal dynamics. Together, these influences shaped the trajectory of caste in India, setting the stage for the more rigid classifications introduced during British colonial rule. In 1857, a significant uprising, known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the First War of Indian Independence, erupted across northern and central India. This rebellion was a response to various grievances, including cultural insensitivity by the British, such as the introduction of new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with beef and pork fat, offending both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The brutal suppression of the rebellion by the British, resulting in widespread atrocities and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, led to a profound shift in British governance. In 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control over India, marking the beginning of the British Raj. Under direct British rule, the colonial administration sought to consolidate power and establish a more efficient system of governance. One of the primary tools employed was the establishment of a comprehensive bureaucracy, which included the implementation of detailed censuses. These censuses, initiated in 1871 and conducted every decade thereafter, systematically categorized the Indian population based on various attributes, including caste, religion, tribe, occupation, and language. The 1901 census, overseen by Sir Herbert Hope Risley, a British ethnographer and colonial administrator, was particularly influential. Risley introduced the concept of classifying Indians into distinct races, such as Aryan, Dravidian, and Mongoloid, based on physical characteristics like the shape and size of the nose, a practice rooted in the now discredited field of scientific racism. This approach not only reinforced existing social divisions, but also introduced new classifications that had not previously been recognized, further entrenching the caste system. The British colonial administration's approach to caste was not merely an academic exercise, but was deeply intertwined with governance and policymaking. The categorization of castes influenced decisions regarding land revenue assessments, with certain castes being taxed more heavily than others based on perceived economic status. Additionally, the classification system played a role in determining eligibility for government employment and access to educational opportunities. Certain castes were deemed more reliable or fit for administrative roles, while others were systematically excluded. This institutionalization of caste distinctions contributed to the rigidification of the caste system, transforming it from a fluid social structure into a fixed and legally recognized hierarchy. The British policy of divide and rule further exacerbated caste divisions. By promoting certain castes over others, the colonial administration fostered a sense of competition and rivalry among different groups. This strategy not only weakened potential alliances among Indian communities, but also diverted attention from the overarching issue of colonial exploitation. The emphasis on caste distinctions served to distract from the broader socio-economic inequalities perpetuated by British rule. The legacy of British colonial policies on the caste system is profound and enduring. The classifications introduced during the colonial era continue to influence contemporary Indian society. While India gained independence in 1947, the structural inequalities and social divisions entrenched during colonial rule persist. The caste system, once a flexible social framework, has become a rigid and institutionalized hierarchy, with lasting implications for social mobility, economic opportunities, and political representation. In conclusion, the British colonial administration played a pivotal role in shaping the caste system in India. Through the implementation of detailed censuses, the introduction of racial classifications, and the strategic manipulation of social divisions, the British not only reinforced existing caste distinctions, but also created new ones. These policies have had a lasting impact, transforming the caste system from a traditional social structure into a rigid and institutionalized hierarchy that continues to affect Indian society today. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British colonial administrators in India implemented a strategy known as divide and rule, which deliberately deepened existing social divisions to maintain control over the subcontinent's vast and diverse population. This approach not only intensified religious and regional tensions, but also institutionalized caste distinctions through state policies and pseudo-scientific classifications. A central figure in this endeavor was Sir Herbert Hope Risley, a British ethnographer and colonial administrator. As the Census Commissioner for India in 1901, Risley conducted extensive studies on the tribes and castes of the Bengal Presidency. He is notable for the formal identification of the centuries-old established caste system of the entire Hindu population of British India. Risley utilized anthropometric data, including measurements of physical features such as nose shape and skull dimensions, to categorize Indians into distinct racial groups. He divided the Indian population into 7 races, assigning each group specific physical and mental characteristics. This approach, now recognized as a form of scientific racism, sought to legitimize the existing social hierarchy by attributing it to inherent biological differences. The British colonial administration also favored certain castes to strengthen their control. Brahmins and Kshatriyas were often appointed to administrative positions, while lower castes were excluded from governance roles. This preferential treatment created a class of loyal collaborators who helped maintain British authority. Additionally, the British implemented policies that restricted the economic and social mobility of lower castes, ensuring that they remained dependent on the colonial system. This manipulation of caste distinctions had lasting effects on Indian society. The rigid categorization of castes and the elevation of certain groups over others reinforced social inequalities and perpetuated divisions that continue to affect India today. The legacy of these colonial policies is evident in the ongoing struggles of marginalized communities for social justice and equality. In conclusion, the British divide and rule strategy in India was a deliberate effort to exploit and entrench social divisions, particularly those based on caste. By institutionalizing these distinctions through administrative practices and pseudo-scientific classifications, the British not only maintained control over India, but also left a legacy of social stratification that continues to influence the country's social dynamics. The British colonial administration in India during the 19th and early 20th centuries implemented policies that severely marginalized and oppressed lower castes and tribal communities. These policies were designed to control, exploit, and suppress these groups, often under the guise of law and order. One of the most notorious pieces of legislation was the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. This act declared entire communities as hereditary criminals, labeling them as predisposed to crime by virtue of their birth. The act was applied to various groups, including certain castes and tribes, without any evidence of criminal activity. For instance, communities such as the Ahirs, Gurjars, and Jats were initially targeted, and over time, the scope expanded to include many Shudras and Untouchables, as well as hill tribes and nomadic groups. These communities were subjected to compulsory registration, surveillance, and restrictions on their movement and residence. The act stigmatized them as criminals, leading to widespread social ostracization and denial of basic rights. The British colonial authorities also implemented policies that economically disenfranchised lower castes and tribal communities. Land reforms and revenue policies often resulted in the confiscation of land from these communities, transferring it to higher castes and colonial officials. This led to a significant concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a few, exacerbating economic inequalities and perpetuating the social hierarchy. The economic marginalization of these communities was compounded by limited access to education and employment opportunities, further entrenching their disadvantaged status. In addition to legal and economic measures, the British colonial administration sought to legitimize and reinforce the caste system through the manipulation of Hindu scriptures. One of the most significant instances of this was the translation and promotion of the Manusmriti, an ancient Hindu text that outlines social and moral codes. British scholars, notably Sir William Jones, translated the Manusmriti into English in the late 18th century. The British colonial authorities then presented this text as a definitive guide to Hindu law and social order, despite its limited historical application and relevance. By elevating the Manusmriti, the British sought to portray the caste system as an intrinsic and unchangeable aspect of Hindu society, thereby justifying their own hierarchical and exploitative policies. These colonial policies had long-lasting effects on Indian society. The stigmatization and marginalization of lower castes and tribal communities created deep social divisions that persisted long after India gained independence. The legacy of the Criminal Tribes Act continues to affect many communities, with some still facing discrimination and exclusion. The economic disparities created by colonial land policies have contributed to ongoing poverty and lack of access to resources in many regions. Furthermore, the colonial manipulation of religious texts has had enduring impacts on the perception and practice of caste in India. In conclusion, the British colonial administration's policies towards lower castes and tribal communities were characterized by systemic oppression and exploitation. Through legislation like the Criminal Tribes Act, economic policies that favored higher castes, and the manipulation of religious texts, the British sought to entrench a social hierarchy that served their interests. The repercussions of these policies are still felt today, underscoring the need for continued efforts towards social justice and equality in India. In the early 20th century, India stood at a crossroads, grappling with the enduring legacy of the caste system. Two towering figures emerged, each offering distinct paths towards social justice and equality: Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Their ideological differences would not only shape the future of the nation, but also ignite a profound debate on the nature of caste, identity, and reform. Mahatma Gandhi, born into the Vaishya merchant caste, was deeply influenced by his experiences in South Africa, where he faced racial discrimination. This exposure to oppression galvanized his commitment to nonviolence and social reform. He viewed untouchability as a moral blight on Hinduism and sought to eradicate it through spiritual awakening and social integration. Gandhi's approach emphasized the purification of Hindu society from within, advocating for the upliftment of the Harijans, children of God, a term he coined for the Untouchables. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, conversely, was born into the Mahar caste, considered untouchable. Experiencing firsthand the brutalities of caste discrimination, Ambedkar pursued education relentlessly, earning degrees from prestigious institutions, including a PhD in economics from Columbia University and law degrees from London. He viewed caste not merely as a social issue, but as a political and structural one, deeply embedded in the fabric of Indian society. Ambedkar argued that true liberation for the oppressed could only be achieved through legal and political means, not just social reform. The ideological chasm between Gandhi and Ambedkar came to a head in 1932 with the British government's Communal Award, which proposed separate electorates for the Untouchables. Gandhi vehemently opposed this, fearing it would further divide Hindu society. In protest, he embarked on a fast unto death, demanding that the Untouchables be integrated into the general electorate. Ambedkar, representing the Untouchables, saw the separate electorates as a means to ensure political representation and safeguard their interests. The ensuing crisis led to the Pune Pact, signed on September 24, 1932, between Gandhi and Ambedkar. While it averted Gandhi's death, the pact resulted in a compromise. Separate electorates were replaced with joint electorates, but with reserved seats for the Untouchables. This arrangement increased the number of seats allocated to them, but did not grant the full political autonomy Ambedkar had sought. The Pune Pact highlighted the tension between Gandhi's vision of a reformed Hindu society and Ambedkar's demand for a complete overhaul of the caste system. Gandhi's approach was rooted in the belief that caste could be reformed from within, while Ambedkar contended that the system was inherently unjust and needed to be dismantled entirely. In the decades that followed, Ambedkar's influence grew. He became the principal architect of the Indian Constitution, ensuring that it enshrined the rights of the oppressed and abolished untouchability. His conversion to Buddhism in 1956 symbolized a rejection of the Hindu caste system and a commitment to social equality. Today, the legacies of Gandhi and Ambedkar continue to shape India's social and political landscape. While Gandhi's emphasis on non-violence and social reform remains influential, Ambedkar's advocacy for legal rights and social justice has inspired generations of Dalit activists and leaders. The ongoing debate between reform from within and radical change underscores the complexities of addressing deeply entrenched social hierarchies. As India progresses into the 21st century, the question remains, can the caste system be reformed, or must it be entirely dismantled? The paths charted by Gandhi and Ambedkar offer contrasting answers, reflecting the enduring struggle for equality and justice in a diverse and complex society. The caste system in India has long been a source of deep social division and inequality. While the country has made significant strides toward equality, the legacy of caste-based discrimination continues to affect millions. The question remains, can India transcend this entrenched system, or is it an inescapable part of its social fabric? The debate between Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, two towering figures in Indian history, epitomizes the divergent paths toward addressing past discrimination. Gandhi, revered as the father of the nation, sought to reform the caste system from within, advocating for the upliftment of the Harijans, or Children of God, a term he coined for the Dalits. He believed that by promoting nonviolence and moral education, the upper castes could be persuaded to abandon untouchability. In contrast, Ambedkar, a Dalit himself, viewed the caste system as inherently oppressive and unredeemable. He argued that true liberation for Dalits could only be achieved by dismantling the system entirely. Ambedkar's efforts culminated in the drafting of the Indian Constitution, which abolished untouchability and enshrined equality before the law. Their differing approaches came to a head during the Pune Pact of 1932, a response to the British government's decision to grant separate electorates to Dalits. Gandhi's fast unto death in protest led to a compromise, resulting in reserved seats for Dalits in the legislature while maintaining joint electorates. While this was a significant step forward, it highlighted the tension between Gandhi's vision of reform and Ambedkar's call for radical change. In the post-independence era, the Indian government implemented affirmative action policies, including reservations in education and employment, to uplift historically marginalized communities. These measures have had a tangible impact, though challenges remain in achieving true social and economic equality. The caste system's legacy is not confined to rural areas, but persists in urban centers as well. Discrimination in housing, employment, and education continues to affect Dalits and other marginalized groups. However, there is a growing movement among the youth and civil society to challenge these entrenched norms and promote inclusivity. The question of whether India can transcend its caste system is complex. While legal frameworks have been established to promote equality, societal attitudes are slower to change. Education, awareness, and sustained activism are crucial in dismantling the prejudices that uphold the caste system. In conclusion, the path to a caste-free India requires a multifaceted approach, combining legal reforms, social awareness, and a commitment to equality. The legacies of Gandhi and Ambedkar continue to inspire and challenge the nation in its ongoing quest for justice and social harmony.